each of these generates its own headline, its own analysis, its own round of commentary. Tracked separately, they all look like a collection of policy disputes and budget fights that we've seen for years. But tracked together, the signal is a little bit harder to miss. The federal government is cutting the safety net and shaking the tightrope at the same time. And so when this burden shifts, but the capacity to carry it doesn't, that's not devolution. It's basically abandonment with a policy justification. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Crisis Lab Podcast. I'm Kyle. I'll be your host today. And one of the things I wanted to talk about was the changes that are happening across the local, the state, and the federal level in the United States with regards to emergency and crisis management. How federal withdrawal from a lot of these programs and the rising threats that we're seeing across the international landscape and also in the United States is really squeezing the state and local entities from both directions. So FEMA's workforce is being cut. The primary federal mitigation grant has been canceled and state disaster reimbursements have been frozen. The Agency Review Council report was gutted before the vote was canceled, and Congress is negotiating wartime supplementals. And the national debt has essentially hit levels not seen since World War II. Now, each of these generates its own headline, its own analysis, its own round of commentary, if you will. And tracked separately, they all look like a collection of policy disputes and budget fights that we've seen for years. But tracked together, the signal is a little bit harder to miss. The federal government is cutting the safety net and shaking the tightrope at the same time. It's basically pulling back from emergency management grants, coordination, and workforce, while also pursuing actions that actively increase the threats to state and local systems, which they subsequently have to manage. And so the policy argument behind this shift, it actually, in some cases, there's theoretical merit to this. States are closer to the problems their communities face. Local leaders carry institutional knowledge that federal administrators or the federal level rarely develops. And reducing that type of bureaucratic complexity between a disaster and the people affected by it is actually a defensible goal. But that argument describes devolution, and this type of devolution means capacity follows responsibility. Additional funding, authority, and coordination resources move with the additional burden down to the state and local level. And so when this burden shifts, but the capacity to carry it doesn't, that's not devolution. It's basically abandonment with a policy justification. So what do the numbers actually look like? And so the scale of the shift is worth pausing on because DHS revoked FEMA's authority to renew contracts without Homeland Security approval and instructed the agency to let existing contracts lapse, effectively eliminating the core workforce, which makes up roughly 40% of FEMA's total staffing. The Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program, the primary federal grant for pre-disaster mitigation, was canceled in April 2025. Emergency management performance grants, the baseline federal funding that keeps state and local emergency management running, have been frozen. $11 billion in disaster reimbursements owed to 45 states sits in limbo with no public timeline for release. And these aren't proposals. They're actually accomplished as facts. And so the FEMA Review Council was supposed to deliver its report last December. The original draft ran to more than 160 pages and reportedly recommended restoring FEMA to a cabinet-level status. DHS leadership reduced it to 20 pages before canceling the vote entirely. And the council has been extended through March 25, 2026. And so that report should be out very soon. Whatever that final report recommends in the next couple of weeks, the dismantlement it was meant to evaluate has already been underway for months. And so where is this burden actually landing now? So earlier analysis in our series of articles on LinkedIn, we examined how emergency management had lost its mission over time. And so under the weight of disaster relief operations, transforming from a coordination function into a massive humanitarian and logistics operation, the agency that emerged from that transformation already diminished its core function, is now being hollowed out even further. And so the question is no longer whether FEMA can reclaim its coordination role, it's who absorbs the burden when federal capacity is no longer there to carry its share. Now, there was a study in 2025 from the Argonne National Laboratory focused on emergency management structures, and that does actually provide the clearest picture of what state and local agencies are actually working with. State emergency management budgets have a median of just $6.3 million. Federal funding makes up anywhere from 0 to 99.4% of state emergency management budgets. At the local level, more than half of all emergency management agencies have one or fewer permanent full-time employees. The Urban Institute confirmed that many states at high disaster risk don't have the fiscal capacity to absorb the greater share of disaster recovery costs without structural changes to how they actually budget and how they govern. Those structural changes have not been made. So the legal authorities and coordination structures don't disappear when federal capacity withdraws. EMACs, interstate compacts, NIMS, state emergency statutes, they all still exist, but they were designed to function as one layer in a multi-tier system, not as the whole thing by itself. And so when the federal tier pulls back, the cost, responsibility, and coordination burden that compresses downward onto the state and local systems that weren't sized or funded now bear that burden. And so the compression doesn't just strain resources. It's not only just a resource issue. It creates and exposes vulnerabilities. A state emergency management agency running on a $6.3 million budget can coordinate within its own borders. It wasn't built to absorb the coordination role for incidents that cross state lines or cascade across multiple sectors or exceed its fiscal capacity to respond without federal reimbursement that may or may never come. Hospital mass casualty plans, port authority supply chain models, state emergency operations center protocols, they're all built to function within a system that includes a federal tier. That's always been a type of planning assumption. And so that tier is being hollowed out and the burden is landing on the levels that are least equipped to absorb it. And this is where we see the squeeze from both directions. The fiscal picture makes restoration hard to imagine anytime soon. Congress is negotiating emergency supplemental defense spending for Iran operations on top of $153 billion in defense funding approved through last year's reconciliation package. U.S. government debt hit 122.3% of GDP at the end of 2025, the most constrained, I should say, fiscal position entering a military conflict in modern American history. And so when a nation enters sustained military engagement, carrying that load, and the money has to come from somewhere, emergency management grants, disaster coordination capacity, and pre-disaster mitigation funding, which is already cut, politically difficult to defend, and ideologically targeted, those become the reachable offset. But the fiscal squeeze is only half the picture. The same federal actions that are diverting resources away from domestic emergency management are also increasing the threats that state and local systems need to manage. Military conflict raises the risk of retaliatory cyber operations against critical infrastructure. It creates supply chain disruptions, energy price shocks, and even domestic targeting. The threat environment is expanding. At the same time, the capacity to address it is contracting. State and local budgets aren't growing to match either side of that equation. NATO's own baseline requirements recognize that military effectiveness depends on resilient civil infrastructure, logistics, and governance. The current trajectory undermines both sides of that equation at the same time. So there is a question that needs an answer now. Every one of those organizations, the state agencies, the hospitals, the port authorities, built its resilience architecture around a workable assumption that is no longer in place. It's no longer there. It's no longer reliable. Most haven't really even adjusted yet. They're still waiting for the other shoe to drop to see what's left and what's remaining. Senior leaders waiting for clarity from Washington before revisiting their plans are using the wrong planning assumption, in my opinion. That clarity isn't coming before the next hurricane season, the next major cyber incident, or the next cascading infrastructure failure is coming. The question of who absorbs the additional burden with what authority and what resources needs an answer at the organizational level now. Not because devolution is wrong in principle, but because the capacity to match the additional burden just hasn't followed. And waiting for it is not really a strategy for us to build resilience. Every organization with a continuity plan that assumes federal resources at current levels should be asking one question this quarter, which is, if the grants are frozen, or that they stay frozen, the reimbursements stay delayed, and the workforce is still going to be cut, what is our plan? If the honest answer is that there isn't one, then time to build it is before the assumption actually gets tested and becomes a reality. All right, everyone, thanks for listening. This is Kyle at Crisis Lab. And again, just one quick point that governance gaps, what we're seeing today, don't really wait for policy clarity. Crisis Lab helps senior professionals build the cross-sector thinking that modern threats demand through applied learning, strategic analysis, and practitioner-led research. The forum at Crisis Lab brings all of that together and brings together senior leaders from emergency management, national security, business continuity, and governance for the kind of ongoing peer exchange and cross-sector dialogue that these types of challenges require. So head over to crisislab.io to learn more, and we'll see you next time.